All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to go over the 7.62 by 39 millimeter Russian. We're going to talk about some of its history, as well as some of its kind of data-driven, as well as some contextual data to go along with that, and a little bit of comparison before everything's said and done. Now, let's go ahead and dive into history. In the 1940s, Russia was confronted during World War II with the first successful application of the intermediate cartridge, which was the 8mm Kurz, or 7.92 by 33, out of the STG-44. Now, this is very interesting time because already for a long time, people have been trying to develop effective select-fire weapon systems. However, everyone had been utilizing full-power rifle cartridges, and this was really messing up the works because even though the BAR was a successful light machine gun, and successful is kind of in quotations, it never really lived up to what it was supposed to be, which was the Browning automatic rifle. The idea that you could have a select fire full power weapon system so that you could utilize semi-automatic fire and then switch it over to full auto whenever it is that you finally got up to a trench line or got rushed by soldiers, whatever it may be. Now, the Russians would also attempt to develop something along this same line called the Fedorov, and this would actually be chambered in 6.5mm Japanese, not 7.62 by 5.4 rimmed, which is very interesting as well. And they went with this because they wanted a lighter recoiling full-power rifle cartridge in order to be able to cut down on recoil. Obviously, lighter recoiling, cut down on recoil. Anyway, regardless, they wanted to go with the 6.5mm round that would generate less energy on the fire so that it'd be easier to keep it on target and all that kind of stuff, and actually be able to work as a select fire machine gun serviced by a single man. It didn't necessarily catch on, it didn't work out. World War I was a very tumultuous time for Russia, as well as, the rest of the world, but especially Russia. Now, this idea, this need would not necessarily go away. We would see it pop up again on the American side of things with the M1 carbine. However, the M1 carbine didn't take full advantage of the intermediate cartridge, first off, by being more or less a stretched out pistol cartridge, second off, by not incorporating full automatic fire, which was originally called for in that planning. We talked about that in our M1 carbine and 30 carbine videos, which I'll put the links in the descriptions to those videos. Links in the description to those videos. So, the Germans figured it out, and they more or less kind of drew on some inspiration from the 30 carbine, developed a very different cartridge overall, but put it into a select fire weapon system and really started pushing them out to the Eastern Front because that's what was really dragging a lot of German resources at the time. Now, I think the Russians were more intrigued by the STG-44 than they were the 7.92 Kurz cartridge. And there's a couple of reasons. In all honesty, as much as the 8mm Kurz is a better application of intermediate cartridge capabilities than the 30 carbine, it's not the best overall. So I think the Soviets found the idea very enticing, but they wanted it better. They wanted it to be just a little bit better. So what we wind up getting developed out of this is actually, you see a lot of really good trends here. And you look at a 7.62 by 39 up against a 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, you might think that a lot of inspiration was drawn from the cartridge, and that parallel has been drawn many times. However, there's quite a few dimensional differences that make them quite different, especially when it comes into performance and all that kind of stuff. So what the Russians would wind up doing was that they would take a 7.62mm bullet, which is typical. Everything the Russians were producing at this time is in 7.62. 7.62 by 5.4, 7.62 Nagant, 7.62 by 25. So of course they would go with a 7.62 intermediate cartridge. They would develop a Spitzer-type bullet initially in a boat tail, though a flat-based was experimented with early on with a little bit longer cartridge casing. They would mount this into a necked, rimless, heavily tapered 39mm long, cartridge casing. Now, again, Spitzer-type bullet, so we're getting advantage of flatter shooting trajectories. Of course, the propellant that's going to be used, moving the projectile roughly 22 to 2,400 feet per second, is taking the best advantage of that cartridge case capacity in order to be able to get the most velocity needed out of smokeless powder in a flat shooting trajectory. The rimless casing working very well in a variety of automatic feeding systems, which this cartridge was intended for, and then also the heavy taper making sure to increase reliability for extraction. you could really see how this is a very advantageous cartridge. Now, the Russians had plans for this to be involved in an entire family of weapon systems, a rifle, a select fire assault rifle, which was more or less supposed to replace submachine guns, and then 2 light machine guns, all chambered in the same cartridge. Now, by 1945, the rifle was more or less off the ground and starting to enter field trials. And shortly thereafter, we had the SKS. By 1947, we had the AK-47 coming online, which would be the most successful application of this cartridge overall. The RPK is still pretty good. That's the automatic rifle application, the 7.62x39, but the RPD wouldn't necessarily catch on nearly as well as the AK and the RPK. Now, of course, the 7.62x39 would become the Soviet standard during the Cold War, and would continue that way all the way up into the 1970s when the Soviets would decide, well, the Russians specifically would decide to develop 5.45x39. Now, about 1975, this would actually be adopted. And there was encouragement for the rest of the Warsaw Pact to go ahead and adopt this cartridge as well. However, not very many people would. And there's a couple of reasons. One, which is kind of a me theory, is that at this point, we're already starting to see some fractures in the foundation of the Soviet Union. So a couple of countries are kind of like, do I really want to keep walking the Russian line on these things? And they kind of push us around a lot. Maybe I'm not so in a hurry to adopt this new cartridge. Maybe I'll just let things kind of play out for a little bit. Now, I think the other aspect of it is that there's a very real dynamic to not want to adopt a new cartridge, because you're not talking about just like making new bullets. No. You need enough of that ammunition to replace your previous stockpiles and then still have enough to be able to have your soldiers be able to train or be able to fight a war with and all that type of stuff. So you've already got a stockpile of a perfectly acceptable cartridge. Why would you be in a rush to replace that stockpile? In addition to that, you have to develop a whole new rifle, which means that you need whole new training plans. You need to get everybody cycled back through and trained on that particular cartridge. You need to develop new manuals. You need to develop new ranges and all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of cost. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of effort. And you could see how if somebody's not necessarily sold on the apparent advancements of this new cartridge, why they wouldn't necessarily want to commit to that cost. And that's what wound up happening in the vast majority of the Soviet Union. A couple of countries would wind up adopting the 5.45, but even those countries, for the most part, would wind up dropping it after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, the wall comes down, and now surplus ammunition and rifles start coming into the United States. And this is where the 7.62x39 kind of gets a little bit of a rebirth, and where it's actually found to be fairly successful as a deer hunting cartridge or a varmint type cartridge used on pigs and all that kind of stuff. Because the rifles are cheap. SKSs at the time were coming in for about $60. And the ammunition was coming in droves for relatively cheap prices. So it was a really fun, easy plinker that you could also use as hunting. Now, this leads a lot of people to refer to the 7.62x39 as kind of a semi-automatic 30-30 Winchester, which, let's go ahead and explore that really quick. So if we take a look at this chart here, we can see that out to about 200 yards, the 30-30 Winchester and the 7.62x39 in 123 grain 7.62x39 and 150 grain Remington Corelock 30-30 Winchester are still really close. However, by about 220, the gap between them has opened up significantly. And as we continue on out towards 500, the 30-30 Winchester drops off rapidly in comparison to the 7.62x39. So, though out to 200, I would say that the comparison of semi-automatic 30-30 is fairly valid. I would say that the 7.62x39 is a better performer than the 30-30 Winchester, at least as far as ballistic drop is concerned, in a comparison between the two. And we'll get into that more here in just a little bit, that comparison aspect. Now, let's go ahead and kind of put into context what it is that we're talking about. So, here's a picture. On the left is the 300 Blackout. In the middle is the 7.62x39. And on the right is the 8mm Kurtz. So that kind of gives us some context as to the size of the 7.62x39. Now, the cartridge's performance overall. The velocities are relatively low for an intermediate cartridge, especially if you compare it to a 5.56, which is what we're going to do now. So right here, I have a 124 grain American Eagle load versus a 62 grain Federal load. And as we can see here, 7.62x39 drops off rapidly in about every way that it can. It drops off velocity much more rapidly than the 62 grain does, and it also drops energy by extension much faster, in addition to having more and more ballistic drop. It's a significant drop difference at 500 yards between the two cartridges. But what do I get for that in comparison to a 5.56? Well, a lot of people tell you that you get more energy. You get, which I don't, this chart kind of plays around to where neither are necessarily jaw-dropping in energy once you get out past about 200 yards. In fact, the 7.62x39 drops below 1,000 foot-pounds of energy shortly after 100 yards, which is what's commonly considered to be acceptable for big game, for at least for as far as one-shot humane kills. Now, a lot of people will tell you that you get so much more energy transfer and that the 7.62x39 is just going to be a better performer against like armor. I would disagree with this, especially when you're talking about like people armor, which neither of these cartridges is going to be good against actual like vehicle armor. What we often forget whenever we talk about body armor type solutions is that we pretend as though it's all like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, where I take a hit in the chest and I fall down and then I get right back up and I get into the fight. That is not reality. There's going to be a massive amount of blunt force trauma if you take a round of the plate, regardless of what your plates are rated for. So sure, you survive the impact, but that does not mean that everything's hunky-dory peachy keen and you can just keep on doing whatever it is that you're doing. You're kind of out of the fight regardless, or you are far diminished in your capability in the fight regardless. 5.56, 7.62x39, not a big difference between the two, especially if you're still talking about FMJ rounds and not actual penetrators. Now, as far as barrier penetration is concerned, the 7.62x39 does have some advantages because specifically FMJ 55 or even 62 grain ammunition without the penetrator in the 5.56 has not been known to be good against actual barriers. So there's that aspect. 7.62x39 might chip away at somebody's cover more quickly than perhaps a 5.56 does. But it's not that big of a difference. Now, some people like to pretend as though the 7.62x39 is just a 200-yard cartridge. It's not. I regularly push the 7.62x39 out to 400. The guys at AK Operators Union regularly push the 7.62x39 out to 500. It's perfectly capable to do that. You just have to take into account a very different ballistic trajectory for that cartridge, which can be a little bit difficult if all of you've ever spent your time around is the 5.56 cartridge. Now, as far as commonality is concerned, there are a lot more 5.56 offerings that are definitely more consistent and perhaps more accurate, and that's where a lot of complaints for accuracy for the 7.62x39 come from. A lot of people say that it's not an accurate cartridge. I argue that cartridges are not what makes something accurate. You can get any cartridge to have consistency and velocity and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to achieve accuracy. That's not something that's limited by the cartridge itself. People say this type of thing all the time. Well, that cartridge is just not that accurate. No. Accuracy, though the cartridge plays a part, is also incumbent upon the rifle, the optic, the shooter. All those types of things are a formula that create good accuracy. A cartridge is just one portion. So, now if you're just primarily shooting steel-cased or surplus ammunition, yeah, you're going to have some accuracy issues with the 7.62x39. But there are accurate loads like the Hornady SST out there that are really great performers in the 7.62x39 loading. I would say and agree that 5.56 has more options along that same aspect. So, in those cases, 5.56 might be more credible to you. And it's one of the things that makes 5.56 AKs kind of interesting because you could say that you get some interesting ballistic capabilities with a 5.56 AK. Now, of course, the 5.56 AKs are kind of a hot button topic for some because a lot of people consider them to be an affront to God and Mikhail Kalashnikov. That's not necessarily what we're talking about right now as much as is the cartridge viable in the system. And as far as having more ammunition choices available, there's something to be said for that in a 5.56 AK, especially since there's actually quite a few 5.56 AKs out on the market right now with a lot of the Yugo imports. Zastava in its M90, I've been seeing quite consistently in my area. Now, that's to say nothing of magazines and all that other kind of stuff that might complicate a 5.56 AK. That's just purely talking about the cartridges. All right, guys, so in my opinion, what's a good use for the 7.62x3.9? Well, I definitely consider it to be excellent plinking ammunition when ammunition's available and cheap, which right now we're going through some dynamics with steel-cased ammo in the 7.62x3.9 loading. I'm fairly convinced that it's going to be a self-correcting issue that eventually we'll get cheap 7.62x3.9. That's based off of a lot of people that are smarter than I and what they have to say on the particular subject. But regardless, that has caused a knee-jerk reaction in the community where people are buying up Tula ammunition at insane prices. I have no interest in partaking in that. But I think it has excellent application as a hunting cartridge for deer. It has excellent application as a varmint cartridge, especially on pigs. And it is still a completely viable defensive round in a lot of different applications. So, guys, overall, I think this pretty much covers my thoughts and opinions on the 7.62x3.9. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
All right, guys, I just want to take a moment to let you guys know that Murph's Law is now on Facebook. I have established an official Facebook page for the channel. I've got a lot of stuff coming up here in the near future, and in general, sometimes I wind up having gaps in coverage where I'm just not necessarily able to generate content or be able to post content. So I still want to be able to interact with you guys, so I established a Facebook group so that you guys can hop on there, ask questions, get involved in debates, discuss different types of gear and all that kind of stuff, and just in general, be able to get some behind the scenes sight at what's going on with Murph's Law, updates on the channel, as well as interaction with other people who are interested in firearms related content, be it medical type stuff or different equipment that they're carrying, daily EDC type stuff, or range experiences and all those types of things. That's the purpose that I want to have for the channel. So if you guys enjoy this content, if you're a subscriber or something along those lines and you want to be able to interact more often or get better access to myself to be able to ask questions and stuff along that line, go ahead and hop on the Facebook page. The link is in the description.